Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So, we're here to hear the other speaker's reversion story. Normally I come, some of you have seen this before, I come with a lot of notes written. I decided that rather than looking down the whole evening, I'd try and think about Shahadas. So this is going to be off the top of my head. So I reverted to Islam in 2004. This is my last year at university in London. And when I first was introduced to, I knew some Muslims from childhood, but I don't think I'd really been exposed to Islam. Just knew some Muslims rather than the deen itself. But I first was exposed to the idea of Islam in 2004 when in France the Hijab was being banned. And so for me at the time it was just a political event rather than something I was interested in for religious reasons. And I decided to turn up, and to be completely frank, I had no idea, even to this day I can't tell you for sure what made me walk into that room. I guess we can call it Hidayah, but so I walked in and it was an event run by one of the MSAs there, and so they were describing, because it's in London it's an international university, so obviously they have some people from France and some other students from elsewhere around the world. And so in this audience were some French students who were explaining their position, and they had some Muslims who were explaining kind of the position of Islam on this issue. What the French students pointed out was that this law technically wasn't written against Muslims. They just said that this was a ban on any overt symbols of religiosity. So in theory, wearing a huge cross was just as much of a reason to be subject to this law as wearing the hijab. Now what the Muslim sisters pointed out was very different. They said that the difference is this: if you're a Christian, you're allowed to wear a cross and you can choose not to wear it. Whereas they took the position that the hijab itself is one of the obligations of Islam, one of the fard, and so they didn't have the free choice to wear it or not wear it. They felt as though they had no choice. And this isn't a problem for them as Muslims. They're saying that we as Muslims, we have certain things we have to do, like pray, like fast during Ramadan, and so on, and this is another one of the obligations. And so they said that this unfairly discriminated against the sisters. Now, the consequence is this: if you wear this hijab, you couldn't wear it in a public place without being either, so for example, public places like public buildings or university. So just as the environment that you're in now, in France, technically you can't wear the hijab. And so the consequence for them was that they would actually be kicked out of their universities and be fined. And so what got my attention was the fact that they were willing to make this sacrifice when, in theory, the system was set up against them. That there was a reason for them to say, you know what, it's a tough situation, I'm going to compromise, I'm going to take this off. And I'm going to identify perhaps primarily as a French citizen rather than as a Muslim. I'm going to take off my hijab. That seemed like the strangest decision to me at the time, given that I didn't know anything else about Islam, but I thought, there's something that's motivating these sisters to do something that seemed almost unthinkable, to kind of give up on their futures instead of giving up on the hijab. And so I went up to the speaker at the front and I said to him, look, frankly I thought he was crazy, but I just said to him, you've said some interesting stuff, do you mind if I find out more? And so he put me in touch with a brother called Majid, who, alhamdulillah, he kept on meeting me for the next 6 months or so. And the key part here was that he managed to find ways to make Islam relevant to the present day. So rather than just describe Islam in terms of something 1400 years ago from a place, in the desert somewhere I'd never even been at that point, he was finding real practical examples of Islam. So the first time I met him was just kind of lunch. The next time was very interesting. We bumped into each other by what, again, seemed like complete chance to me at the time. And there was an India versus Pakistan cricket match happening. I'm sure you're all kind of looking around, I can guess many of you are familiar with this, where the deal is, you go to, it was they had a university bar, right? Because the drinking age is a bit lower, so they had a university bar, and if you go in there, you'll see some Pakistani students on one side with their flags waving, and you'll see the Indian students on the other side. And until this point, I was planning on going, I was only so interested in cricket, but I thought, okay, I'll turn up. And so I went there, and just at the door, as I'm about to walk into this bar, I see Majid, and he says, you going in? I said, I'm only so interested. So he and I decided to go grab some lunch. And rather than tell me drinking is haram, that's why I'm not going in there, he said, the problem I have with this event and the reason I'm not going, says Majid, is that the people are divided. You have what were, before, until this point, everybody was a student at the same university, studying the same, probably you're from the same class, you're from the same backgrounds, you're all friends with each other. And then when this outside event happens, when this cricket match takes place, all of a sudden, you divide and split into these two groups. And if anyone's interested, it's actually, so he quoted from Surah number 3, ayah 102 and 103. If you want to look this up afterwards, but basically, and I'm going to paraphrase here. Paraphrasing, yeah? Actually, let me look it up, inshallah. But the point is that he said that the people, their obligation is to be bound by Islam. And that until this point, you were all friends, and suddenly now the room splits. And it's not just that it splits into India versus Pakistan. In fact, he said it gets worse. So when someone from Pakistan is on the cricket team, Pakistani cricket team, and they're playing, and it's because of him that they lose some runs, now what happens, they say, this guy, you see, he's Punjabi. We don't like this Punjabi because they're from somewhere else. They're Gujarati, they're Mirpuri, they're this or that, the other. They've got some other explanation for why those guys suck. Oh, no, we're better than you because you're from this place and I'm from that place, right? And he said that ayah from the Quran, which Abu Sumaya, inshallah, was the turn off my phone. It's Surah number 3, ayah 102, Al Imran. And it begins with, O you who believe, hold tight to the rope of Allah and do not be divided. Got it? See, I said I should have been better prepared. Everybody in the room looking it up. O you who believe, hold tight to the rope of Allah and do not be divided. You have it? Jazakallah khair. So, O you who believe, be careful of your duty to Allah. Is this the right one? That's it.
Different translation.
And do with care, which is due to Him, and do not die unless you are Muslims. And hold fast by the covenants of Allah, the rope of Allah, all together, and be not disunited. And remember the favor of Allah upon you when you were enemies. You were on the brink of the pit of fire, and by His favor He united your hearts, and you became brethren. And He saved you thus from it. Thus does Allah make His signs and communications clear that you might be guided. Now, if you notice the end of this ayah says that Allah will, from these ayat of the Quran, Allah will guide people. And this is specifically what Majid was doing. With these two ayat, he found a way to guide me to Islam through a cricket match, something that you might otherwise find completely secular. And he found a way to link it back and say, these people are being divided because their bond is a bond of nationalism. It's based on where are they from. In fact, for most of them, it's not even where they're from, it's where their parents were from. This is how absurd it was for them to be disunited. When the ayah of the Quran says to hold tight to the rope of Allah, all of you together. And that through this, Allah will guide you. Alhamdulillah, I consider that one of the people who was guided through these ayat was me. And so now, what happened was this regular, practical application of Islam. It now no longer was something from the desert 1400 years ago, from some guy in some language I'd never even heard of. Suddenly it became about me there and then in London. And this was something I wasn't expecting at all. So alhamdulillah, that's my first introduction to Islam, was about the hijab. And there was something that motivated these sisters. And the brothers who I then met subsequently were showing me that Islam had a real application in this life. And the next, and this is the critical point, and this actually goes back to what the sisters knew, and at the time I didn't. There is a way for you to know for sure. What was it that was making somebody give up on what was otherwise, it seemed like the easy option to say, I'm going to give up the hijab. Instead, they said, I'm going to give up on my university education. As hard as a decision as that might be, for especially everybody in this room, they gave up on that and they held tight to the rope of Allah. Why? Because they had an absolute answer to this question. They knew for sure that Allah exists, and they knew for sure that they could prove this fact. It wasn't just a belief that came to them as an emotion. It wasn't that they felt something. I'm not saying that they were free from emotion. I'm saying that they knew this principally. They knew it for sure, and they knew it without any doubt, that Allah definitely exists, and that you can prove this to anybody. And to the extent it matters, I've had this conversation, not in this format, I'm saying I've spoken to individuals before, not one, and I've spoken to at least a dozen or more people like this, not one person to date has ever come away saying, nah, you're wrong, the creator of the universe doesn't exist. They're absolutely sure, and that's how obvious it actually is. It's not that I'm being anything special, it's that it is that plain as day. Now, there is a way to prove this fact. And so Majid went about proving it to me that Allah definitely exists, and that the message of the Quran absolutely is the word of the Creator. And that one fact completely changed everything from that point forward. Now it was no longer a matter of faith or belief or trust, it was absolute certainty. And alhamdulillah, 6 months down the line, I took my Shahada and said, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. So that is the condensed version of my Shahada.